Get ready for 30 more minutes.
The day of miracles has come!
Starting now. This is the Sports Source.
We do have 30 more minutes for you, and it's all football, starting with this segment brought to you by Southeast Termite and Pest Control. Global travel. People travel faster and further and easier than ever these days, and in the news you can see where that helps the spread of bad diseases. It's kind of scary out there. Something it's also done, it's brought back bed bugs. That is a problem that kind of disappeared for years and years and years, but global travel has really gotten easier, and more people are finding themselves with bed bugs from a hotel, bed bugs from a cruise ship, bed bugs from an airline seat. If you wind up as one of those bad luck folks who gets bed bugs and they're back on your house with you, call the local experts, Southeast Termite and Pest Control. They can get rid of them for you, and they do it quick. They are really good, Southeast Termite and Pest Control. All right. Take a look at this, and I'll explain it in a second. What we got, somebody recently emailed me to suggest I try and look at the rosters of Tennessee, Florida, and Georgia after signing day, but not just by the recruiting class, by the actual rosters, meaning guys who've transferred in, guys who transferred out, guys who went to the NFL. It's not easy to do. So what you get is a ballpark, because some schools have guys like Brandon Johnson at Tennessee, who was a senior, but he redshirted, and he's coming back. I don't have the time to go through Florida's entire roster to check all that. So what I did was I lopped off all seniors. Some schools, like Florida, count their walk-ons probably, is why they have more players total. But the gist is pretty true. So what you get is the rosters as of now in terms of ballpark for Tennessee, Florida, and Georgia. 5 stars. Tennessee has 5 on the roster. Florida, 4. Georgia, 15. And these are using the 24/7's composite ratings. 4 stars, you see that Georgia and Florida both have a lot more than Tennessee. 3 stars, you see Tennessee has a lot more than Florida and a whole lot more than Georgia. In terms of the recruits, you look at the high-end guys. Tennessee signed 13 4 and 5 stars in this class. Florida signed 18 4 and 5 stars. Georgia signed 19 4 and 5 stars. My question then, how close is Tennessee to catching Florida and Georgia? And let's leave that up there for a second. There's no question they're getting closer, but 5 and 4 stars still lean heavy Florida, Georgia, and 3 stars leans heavy Tennessee. How close is Tennessee to catching those 2 schools above them?
I think my biggest takeaway is you can only play 11 guys at one time, but
Yeah.
what that does is when you have to reload or when you get guys hurt, obviously Georgia and Florida are going to be more well-suited to handle those. I mean, Tennessee right now, you look at their starting 22, they don't have a lot of places where they're just like, oh, that's going to be a disaster. But you start looking beyond that. I mean, if Tennessee loses a linebacker or 2 next year, you better hope that they got some guys. You lose a safety or 2, you're going to be playing some really, really young guys. So I think that's what I stand out is if you can stay healthy, you can make it interesting. But you start getting some injuries, it's pretty obvious who's better suited to handle those things.
Well, and that's why it may be I think a lot of people like the idea of getting Florida or Georgia later in the season. But right now, that would favor Georgia, you would think, because if you're talking about injuries late in the season, they're better equipped to deal with it. Your thoughts on how close Tennessee is to Florida and Georgia at the moment?
I think they're closing in. I definitely don't think they're there yet by any means. I mean, back-to-back classes now, they finished 13th and 10th. That's much more along the lines of what you need to do in a rebuilding job to get there, but you've got to keep building on this. I think it's going to take another recruiting class probably before you're really in that discussion of having a roster that sort of stacks up, because the upper ends of this roster, the seniors and juniors, come from a top 25 class and a class that was outside the top 15. So you're still catching up, definitely closing the gap though with these last 2 classes, and especially what they did on signing day.
Yeah, gap's closing, but catching up, I mean, those Georgia numbers, I mean, that's a behemoth at the top. So if this is the year you move it to November. So if depth does become an issue for one team, it's more likely Tennessee. Also, even with the Florida numbers, that's why with what we talked about earlier in the show, a lot of people out there are going to say, okay, that talk's fine. Let's see it on the field in September, because on the field, Dan Mullen versus Jeremy Pruitt, Tennessee's lost by 26 and 31 points. Now, you get them at home this year, and you will have had time for the players to develop, and some guys who have outperformed maybe what they were expected to be, but it is going to be, okay, show us something before we start to buy into the talk. There are Tennessee fans that are going to say that as well.
Well, yeah, and I think you also have to keep in mind, as we always point out, I've said this for years, recruiting ratings are they're a GPS. They point you in the right direction, but they're a compass. They point you in the right direction. They're not a GPS, which is, oh yeah, this guy's going to make it, this guy won't make it, this guy will be the. It's not exact. If it were, Tennessee wouldn't have lost to Georgia State in terms of show it to me on the field.
Right.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you showed those numbers because it's a reminder of how difficult it is to catch up in talent in the Southeastern Conference. You can add a great class,
A top 10 class.
But then so's half the rest of the league. So it's very difficult. At this point, the difference has to be that they're developing players at a better rate than they did under Butch Jones.
Yes.
So the hit percentage now of those numbers can allow you to catch up. Still got a ways to go, obviously, to get to Georgia. Florida's closer range. But now it's about the hit percentage and those working out and not having guys, Pruitt signees, leave like Butch Jones had a lot of his players leave.
Which is another interesting thing that that's good. You're producing the show because I was going to say that's now going to start to be. You didn't see a lot of that in Butch's first 2 years when he had those couple of good classes and people started getting in here, and then the promised playing time wasn't there. They ran for the exits. Pruitt's now going to start dealing with that. The more you stack the roster, the tougher it is for everybody to get on the field. So it'll be interesting to see how many, and it's not just a Tennessee thing. I mean, Alabama loses guys, Georgia loses guys. I mean, everybody in the college football playoff this year basically had a quarterback from somewhere else. Yep. So, yeah, I think that that's another interesting thing to watch moving forward. How many of these guys can he hold on to? And he has done a much better job than Butch Jones at this point. But as he stacks the roster, are you going to have more guys that say, hey, wait a second, you told me I'd get to play?
But is it his guys that he signed that thought they were going to play under him, or is it some of the older guys that don't fit what he wants to do or his mindset? Are those the guys that are bailing on?
Yeah, that latter number is trimming, but so far only one Pruitt signee has left the team, Gerard Means. But yeah, as the roster becomes more and more Pruitt, we'll see how that goes and how they handle that. It's not easy for anybody.
Yeah, and that's an everywhere problem. Again, that's not just Tennessee, but that's you haven't had to deal with that because your roster has been below stacked. You had guys that got on the field because they had to. Once you start loading your roster up, now you're going to be like everybody else and having to start play the ego games with people and make sure everybody's getting the right amount of ego stroke. When we come back, is it too soon to even be talking about an East Division championship? Because I know people are going to be talking about it. It's going to be all summer. But we're going to take a look at the last 10 division champions in the SEC and the recruiting classes they had to have to get to the championship game. How does Tennessee stack up? That's next. We'll be back.